Years later, when folks asked old Tom Bayliss how the Pryor place had stayed out of Hollister hands when every other quarter section in that valley had folded, he always set down his coffee, looked toward the ridge, and said the same thing. It hadn't been the rifle. It hadn't been the lawyers. It had been the woman who walked out of that ranch house in her dead husband's coat the morning 3 Hollister riders cut her north fence and drove 40 head of her cattle straight onto barren land. Her name was Marin Pryor, and she was 31 that spring. Tom told it like this: the riders had come at first light, the way Cyrus Hollister's men always did. Sure, no one would push back before breakfast. They cut the wire clean. They moved her cattle in a wide, easy sweep, whistling like it was their own herd. Marin was already at the kitchen window when she saw the dust. She set down the cup of chicory coffee she hadn't even tasted, took her husband Edmund's coat off the peg by the door, and put it on over her work dress. The coat was too big in the shoulders. She did not stop to fix it. She lifted the old sharps off the rack and walked out into the yard. Tom was riding fence on his own line a half-mile east. He saw her step off the porch, and he started his horse toward her without thinking. Because he had known Edmund Pryor since they were boys, and he had promised Edmund, at the burying 2 winters past, that he would look in on Marin. He had been looking in ever since. He had never once seen her look like she did that morning. She did not run. She walked. Tom would say later that was the part the men did not expect. They expected weeping, or a shouted curse, or the gate slammed and bolted. They did not expect a small woman in a man's coat walking steadily down her own road, carrying a rifle she clearly knew how to load. The lead rider was a long-faced man named Pell. "Those are my cattle," Marin said. "Strayed onto Mr. Hollister's range," Pell said. "He'll be sending a bill for the grass." "The fence was cut," she said. "I can see the wire from here. Old fence. Wind, maybe. Wind doesn't cut 3 strands clean in a line." Tom had reined up at the edge of the yard. He saw the second rider drift his hand toward the rifle scabbard, and he eased his own coat back from his hip. He did not pull. He waited. He had learned from Edmund, long ago, that a man who pulled first in front of Marin Pryor usually wished he hadn't. She did not raise the sharps. She held it across her body, low, the way a working hand carries a tool. "Turn them back," Pell laughed. "Ma'am, you go on inside. This here is between Mr. Hollister and the deed. He's offered you a fair price 3 times now." "He offered me a price," Marin said. "It was not fair." And the answer was no. "Last chance to be reasonable, ma'am." "I am being reasonable," she said. "Turn them back, or ride in alone, and explain to your boss why 40 head and 3 men got held at a widow's gate." Pell's grin tightened. He looked past her at Tom. "This your dog, Bayliss?" "I'm a neighbor," Tom said. "Same as you'd be, if you remembered how." For a long moment, nobody moved. The cattle behind the riders milled and lowed. A meadowlark started up out in the grass and stopped, as if it had thought better of singing. Then Marin stepped sideways, 3 slow steps, and put herself between the riders and the open gate of her own corral. "Turn them," she said again. Pell looked at his 2 men. He looked at Tom. He looked at the woman in the coat that had belonged to a man he had probably drunk with once, and something passed behind his eyes that was not respect, exactly, but close enough to keep him alive. He spat. He jerked his chin at the others. The 40 head were swung in a wide, sullen arc and pushed back through the cut wire onto Pryor grass. Pell tipped his hat as he passed her, but he did not look at her face. "Tell Mr. Hollister," Marin said to his back, "I will mend the fence by sundown. Tell him if he cuts it again, he can come ride out himself and say so." Tom would say, telling it at his kitchen table years on, that he watched the 3 of them ride east toward the Hollister camp on the bluff, and he could see the smoke from Cyrus's cook fire already going up thin and white in the morning. He said he pictured Pell riding into that camp with 40 head short and a story he did not want to tell. And the Baron sitting in his canvas chair under the awning he had freighted out from Cheyenne, and the long silence after. Tom said a man like Cyrus Hollister could buy a great many things, but he had never yet figured out how to buy the silence of a small woman who had decided to keep her own ground. Maren had not moved from where she stood until the last rider was out of sight. Only then did she turn. Then she went back into the house, set the sharps down on the kitchen table, and her hands began, finally, to shake. Tom mended the fence with her that afternoon. They did not talk much. She held the staples. He drove them. The sun was hot on their necks and on the wire. At one point she said, without looking at him, "Edmund would have killed that man." And Tom said, without looking at her, "Edmund would have lost his ranch a year ago." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. They kept working. "That should have been the end of it," Tom would say, if Cyrus Hollister had been any other man. But Cyrus had spent 15 years buying up the valley, one tired widow and one foreclosed homesteader at a time, and he had never been told no by a small woman in a dead man's coat. He took it as something said to the whole valley. He could not let it stand. So a week later he sent his lawyer. The lawyer's name was Mr. Garrett, and he came up the road in a polished buggy with a leather case across his lap. Tom was there because Tom was always there now. Mending the corner gate, splitting a little wood she would never ask him to split, sitting on the porch in the late afternoon while she made coffee that was finally hot when she drank it. Tom had not said anything to her about why he was always there. She had not asked. They were both, in their separate ways, still inside their grief. And neither of them was ready to call what was happening between them by a name. Garrett climbed down from the buggy and tipped his hat to Maren with the kind of smile that has paper underneath it. "Mrs. Pryor, Mr. Hollister has authorized me to make a final offer." She did not invite him onto the porch. "Read it." "Regentanta. Regentanta. Read it. Regentanta. Read it. Read it. Regentanta." He opened the case. He read a number. It was nearly double what Cyrus had offered before. Tom heard it and did not breathe for a second. Because it was enough money for a woman alone to start somewhere easier, somewhere greener, somewhere a man like Cyrus Hollister did not own the sheriff. Maren said, "No, ma'am," Garrett said. "With respect, the bank notes on your spring cattle drive are due in November. Mr. Hollister has, spoken with the bank. They have indicated they will not extend you further credit. You will lose this land in 3 months, whether you sell it now or not. He is offering you the dignity of choosing." "Dignity," Maren repeated. The word came out flat as a stone. "He is offering me dignity." "Ma'am, my husband broke this ground," Maren said. "He died of a fever sleeping on it in a storm, because we could not afford a second hand that spring. I buried him under the cottonwood by the creek. There is dignity in this dirt, Mr. Garrett. It is not Mr. Hollister's to offer me." Garrett's smile thinned. 3 months, Mrs. Pryor. 3 months, she said. "Then I have 3 months." She closed the door on him while he was still bowing. Inside, she sat down at the kitchen table and did not cry. Tom would remember that. She did not cry. She took out the ledger and started doing sums. After a minute, she said, without looking up, "Tom, sit down. I need you to tell me what you actually think." He sat. He told her. He said Hollister probably had the bank. Yes, but Hollister did not have every bank, and there was a small Scottish-run outfit 2 towns over that had been lending against fall calves to people Cyrus had crossed. He said the cattle drive to the railhead was the thing. If she could get her herd to Bender Crossing before the first storm, she could pay the spring notes herself, and Cyrus could go whistle. He said the only problem was the route. Cyrus's land sat between her gate and the railhead like a wall. The legal way around added 4 days. 4 days was a storm. "There is a back trail," he said, "through the breaks. It is hard country, and there is one stretch where you cross the corner of Crown Hill. That is open range. It is not Hollister's. It only looks like it on his maps." "It only looks like it on his maps," Maren said. and he will tell every rider he owns it. Yes, and he will come. He will come, Tom said. She was quiet a long time. Then she said, I do not have enough hands. You have me, he said. She looked up at him then. And Tom said he had never in all his life been looked at quite that way. Not even by his own wife, who had been kind to him and gone too young, because the way Maren Pryor looked at him was the way someone looks at a person they have been afraid to need and have decided to need anyway. Then we go, she said. They left at the dark end of the next week. Tom had brought 2 of his own hands, men he trusted, and an old Welsh drover named Hatch, who owed Edmund Pryor a debt nobody but Hatch remembered. 4 men, 1 woman, 312 head. They moved at night through the breaks because Tom said any rider Hollister put out would have to see them to stop them. And at night, nobody saw anyone. Maren rode at the head. She did not wear Edmund's coat anymore. It had been altered to fit her shoulders. She wore it now, like a thing of her own. The first night went hard. A young steer broke for a draw, and one of Tom's hands, a kid named Wells, was nearly thrown, trying to turn him in the dark. Maren rode in beside him, cut the steer back into the line, and never said a word about it. Wells told Tom later, at the next fire, that she had ridden past him in the moonlight, and he had understood. Finally, why Tom had not stopped working her gait for 2 years. He said it the way a young man says a thing he has just learned about the world. Tom told him to drink his coffee and shut his mouth. And the kid grinned and did both. When Tom told this part, years later, his voice always slowed. He would say the boy Wells had gone on to homestead his own quarter section north of the river and had raised 3 sons of his own, and the eldest had been named Maren, after the woman in the moonlight. Tom said that was the part he wanted folks to understand. He said a woman who stands her ground does not stand it only for herself. She stands it for the names that come after. He would let that sit at the table a moment. Then he would pick his coffee back up and go on. The second night was worse. A summer-tail thunderhead came down off the rim, and the herd nearly stampeded at a sheet of lightning. Hatch sang to them an old hymn in Welsh that none of the cattle understood, and all of them obeyed, and Maren rode the long side of the moving herd in the rain, one hand on her saddle horn and the other steady on the reins, and held them. By dawn, they were soaked and sore, and a half day behind, but they still had every head. Tom said, years later, that he watched her come in off the line at first light, with her hat brim weeping water, and her gloves split at the seams, and she had gone to the cook fire and warmed her hands for 1 minute, and then walked over to Wells, the boy who had nearly been thrown the night before, and told him plainly that he had ridden a hard piece of country well, and to do it again tonight. The boy had not slept after that. He had only stood by his horse and waited for the dark. They crossed Crown Hill at the second dawn. The herd was strung out 1/2 mile, and they were halfway across the long, open shoulder when Hatch put up his hand and pointed. A line of riders was coming up out of the south draw. 6 of them. Then 8. Then more. Pell was at the front. Tom would say, years later, that he reached for his rifle without thinking, and Maren reached out and put her hand flat on the stock and pushed it gently down. Not first, she said. Never first. She rode out alone to meet them. Tom said his heart climbed into his throat and stayed there. He had never been more sure he was about to watch a brave thing turn into a dead thing. But Maren rode straight at Pell at a steady working trot, and when she was 20 yards from the line of riders, she stopped. And she sat her horse, and she said, in a carrying voice the whole valley could have heard if the valley had been listening, "This is open range. This is not Mr. Hollister's. Anyone who lifts a rifle here lifts it against the territory, not against me. Anyone who lifts a rifle here is the man who will hang for it. Mr. Hollister will not hang. You will. Tell me, Mr. Pell, which one of you he has decided is worth less than my land." Pell did not answer. None of them did. She let the silence sit. Then she said, almost gently, "Ride back." I am taking my cattle to my railhead. I am paying my notes with my money. When that is done, Mr. Hollister can sit on his porch and look at my fence for as long as he likes. The valley is going to know how this morning went. It will know who blinked. Choose. A long moment. Then, a young rider, near the back of the line. A boy, really, maybe 19, with a thin neck and a borrowed hat, turned his horse and started back down the draw. Then, another, then a third. Pell sat alone with 3 men, then 2. He looked at Marin. He looked past her at Tom, and at Hatch, and at the herd, and at the sky, which was already beginning to thicken in the west, with the first storm. He spat onto the grass. He turned his horse. He rode back down the draw without a word. They put the herd through Bender Crossing 2 days ahead of the snow. The Scottish outfit took their note. The check cleared. Marin rode home with paper in her saddlebag that said her land was hers free and clear into the next spring, and a long way past it if she wanted. Word ran ahead of them down the valley. By the time they turned the last bend before her gate, there were 2 old homesteaders waiting on the road in their wagons, hats in their hands. One was a man named Quint, who had sold to Hollister 3 years back for half what his ground was worth. He did not have much left and he knew it, but he had brought a sack of seed corn and a jar of his wife's preserves, and he set them in Marin's hands without making a speech about it. The other was a widow named Mrs. Lyle, whose husband had been a friend of Edmund's. She did not bring anything. She only stepped up to Marin in the road, took both her hands, and looked at her a long moment. Then she said, plainly, "Thank you, child." Marin did not answer. She did not need to. Tom watched her face and saw a thing settle there that the last 2.5 years had been waiting to settle. She did not say anything to Tom for most of the ride home. The country was beautiful that week, yellow grass, hard blue sky, the cottonwoods along the creeks already turning. They camped one night on a low rise above a slow creek, and after the others were asleep, Marin walked out a little way alone with her tin cup of coffee and stood looking back the way they had come. Tom watched her from the fire and did not follow. He had learned, in 2.5 years of patient neighboring, that Marin Pryor did most of her hardest thinking standing up, with her back straight and a tin cup in her hand, and that the only proper answer to it was to keep the fire going and wait. When she came back, she sat down across from him and held her hands out to the heat. She said, "Edmund did not own that ranch, Tom. Edmund and I bought it, with my schoolteacher money out of Independence and his wages out of 2 seasons on the Goodnight. I had forgotten that. I had let myself forget it. Hollister did me one favor. He made me remember." Tom nodded. He did not say anything. There was nothing to add to it. On the last evening, with the Pryor house showing as a small square of lamplight a mile off, she pulled up her horse and waited until he came alongside. "Tom Bayliss," she said. "Marin, I have been a widow 2.5 years," she said, "and I have not, in any of it, asked a man for a single thing I did not pay back the next morning. Do you know why I am telling you that? I think so. Tell me then." He took off his hat. He turned it in his hands. He said, "Because what you are about to say to me, you are saying as a woman who chose to say it, not a woman who needed to." She smiled. It was the first real smile he had seen on her face in a long, long time. "Yes," she said. "Exactly that." She did not say more that night. She did not have to. Tom rode her to her gate and tipped his hat and went home. But in the spring, when the cottonwoods leafed out by Edmund's grave, and the calves were on the ground, and the valley had decided, finally, that the Pryor place was not going to fold, Marin Pryor walked across her own yard in a clean blue dress and met Tom Bayliss at her own porch, and asked him plainly if he meant to keep coming around as a neighbor, or as something more honest than that. He said honest. She said good. They were married under the cottonwood, near Edmund, with the valley watching, because Marin said Edmund had been a good man, and the good of him was in this ground, and she would not begin a new life by pretending the old one had not been a life. Tom thought about that for a long time afterward. He thought about how she had walked out of that house in a dead man's coat and brought herself, by inches and by the standing up of it, all the way back into her own. Cyrus Hollister died 3 winters later, of a stroke, in a house he had bought from a widow who had not been Marin. The valley went on. Tom and Marin Pryor, for she kept the name. She had earned it twice, raised cattle, and 2 daughters, and a boy, and lived plain and well, on land that had been bought with grief, and held with grit, and made green again by the kind of love that grows. Tom would always say, only in the standing up. People asked Tom, when he was old, what he remembered first about her. They expected him to say the day at the gate, or Crown Hill, or the wedding. He never said any of those. He always said it was the morning after the lawyer left, when he had walked into the kitchen with a load of split kindling under his arm, and found her at the table with the ledger open, and she had looked up at him without surprise, and said only, "Sit down, Tom. We have work." She had reclaimed the dignity Hollister had tried to offer her by reaching across his table and taking it back in her own hand. And the love had come, Tom always said. Not before that, and not in spite of it, but because of it. Grown straight up out of the standing. That was how he told it. That was how it was. And the cottonwood, by the creek, which Edmund had planted his first spring on the place, stood through every winter of their long life together, and was still standing when Tom himself went into the ground beside Edmund, 3 rows over, with Marin still upright and turning the page on a New Year's ledger in the kitchen by the lamp.